This is the first of our Christmas lectures that we've ever held, so it's quite exciting really. We've come a long way. Grant is going to give us an introduction and overview of how he sees global food security linking in with our work, and then we've got Carly who's going to talk about the culture aspects of our research work, and then we've got Charlie who's going to talk about understanding the impact of our work. So, Grant.
Thank you, Dominic Chair. So, hi everyone. I've seen most of you on my visits down here. I've been involved with the hatchery now for I don't know how many years, 5 years, 6 years maybe, something like this. We've got a scientific panel committee that we've formed a few years ago, and I think the idea of that is it sort of interacts with the board of trustees here to give them information about where the science is going in the area that we're all familiar with, and not only the science but actually the direction of the whole thing. So what's the point of all of this? Why do we bother growing lobsters and putting them into the sea? So in my kind of day job, I work at CEFAS, and CEFAS is the agency of DEFRA who provide advice on sort of fisheries and aquaculture and disease and that kind of thing. So this, the place you're working at is actually classified as a farm. You probably might not know that, but it's classified as a UK fish farm, and in that case it's registered under the aquatic production businesses of the UK. So although you may not think you're working in a farm, you actually are. So what is the narrative? That's why I kind of thought about talking about to you today before I introduce Carly and Charlie on the specifics. Again, at CEFAS we've been thinking a lot about the narrative of what's sort of called aquatic food security in recent years, especially this year actually, and to see how sort of fisheries and aquaculture kind of overlap and interact to provide aquatic food. So if you can change the slide, Don. I thought I'd give you a bit of an overview about generally what I work on. I work on mainly actually in tropical shrimp, things like this here, in this fishmonger's slab. But this is all about making food, actually, food security, making food, and what does it mean? Well, if you look at the definitions of food security, everyone's heard that buzzword a little bit, I think. There's some very high level and very aspirational sort of ideas about what that means. All people all the time getting access to everything they need. In the context of that, there are some real big changes happening globally. So by 2050, another 30 years or so down the line, there's going to be another sort of 2 billion people on Earth. And not only are there going to be more people, they're going to be a lot more middle class people. And those are not people shopping Waitrose necessarily, but these are people who have between $10 and $100 a day to spend on things. That's what middle class means from the point of view of sort of global spend. In that context, 300 million is another EU. Okay, that's what it roughly equates to on Earth. So people with spending power. Currently, 1 in 7 people are underfed and 1 in 7 are overfed on Earth. That's the rough. And most of us are probably in the latter category, even though we don't think we are. And the idea of food security is really in the context of increasing competition for land, food, water, resources, and all the other stuff. So growing more food and making more food is going to be tricky if we haven't got enough resource or there's a lot of competition for it. So food security, if you look at it as an overall concept, is actually quite aspirational. It's something that there's a lot of challenges to get to that point. And it's a great challenge which requires a lot of different people to be interacting on their experiences. So, next slide. So what about the aquatic part of food security? Food security encompasses beef and pigs and cows and wheat and rice and all these types of things. But aquatics are in there as well as a major component. And the rise in aquatic production, either from fisheries or from aquaculture, has risen hugely in the last number of years, so 50 years or so. 20 million metric tons to about 160 million metric tons now, globally. Amazingly, actually, 40% of that enters international trade. So of all the food groups, whether it's wheat or cows or whatever, this is the highest traded food commodity on Earth, which is quite amazing because it's perishable, difficult to transport, that kind of thing, but it still gets traded a lot. And the export value is around about 130 billion at the moment for seafood being traded around the world, much of which we trade in and out of Europe. Most of the production occurs in developing countries or low-income food deficit countries in Southeast Asia and Africa and South America. And most of the trade of those countries is to developed countries, like ourselves in Europe and the States and Japan. But the growth area in the future is between developing countries, so-called South-South trade. If you look at so there's an increased requirement of fish by people to eat. That's a given with the global population going up. If you look at the production of fisheries over the last 100 years, most of this is sort of FAO data globally, but there's a lot of, at the UK level, a lot of CEFAS data involved with this type of thing. Fisheries, this is marine fisheries, has just flatlined after about sort of 1990. There's no more fish coming out of the sea each year. So it's in relation to an increasing population, there's a flatline in fisheries. So we do the next two as well, Don. If you add freshwater fisheries to that, this is this yellow area here, there is, again, no real increase. It's just pretty much flatlined over the last 20 or 30 years. But aquaculture in the blue there has just risen and risen as a proportion of global production. So now it equates to around about 50% of all the fish that we eat. So if you go down to the supermarkets and look at the fishmongers, about half of those fish are grown and not caught. That's where we are at the moment. If you look at this in terms of Europe, Europe is a very similar story to that fishery. The fishery has gone down and down and down and flatlined. In fact, it's declining at the moment with common fisheries policy and other things coming in, and overfishing has led to this red line going down. And aquaculture really hasn't sort of filled the gap. It increased over the early 90s, and really, if you look at the width of this blue line, it's not really ever increased over the last number of years for lots of reasons, including NIMBYism, regulations, so on, so where you can't put a farm out there. So that's one of the bigger issues with Europe about expanding operations, is that we are fisheries, we are fisheries-based culture. We get a warm-hearted feeling when we look out and see a fishing boat, but maybe we don't get such a nice feeling when we see a fish farm. And that's a cultural thing compared to, say, parts of Asia. If you look in Asia, you've got this fishery at the bottom, which is sort of steadily increasing without as much regulation as there is in Europe. So there's some poor practice going on here as well as standard fisheries. But the aquaculture has just gone up and up. So they've really embraced aquaculture, and most of aquaculture now comes from Asia. So next slide. If you look at the UK, this is fisheries in the UK. It shows a very similar pattern. So bringing it home to really what we're working on within our own sort of environment here. These are the two world wars, there and there. So you can see fisheries production, people going out fishing and catching fish to eat went right down in those two periods of time. But if you look at where we are now, fish production from the UK seas has never been at as low a point as it has been since those two wars. So despite a growing population in the UK and a growing demand, our fisheries has never been lower than it was in those two wars. So if you do the next two, Don. So there's a population going up, there's a fishery, and fisheries going down. And aquaculture actually has done an okay job within the UK. The UK is sort of one of the top producers, if not the top producer in Europe. But pretty much 99% of this comes from Atlantic salmon grown in Scotland. So England and Wales is a very minor industry, and most of this comes from north of the border. So next one. So where does the fish come from then? So we've got the population going up, the fisheries going down, we don't make the aquaculture. So what do? Well, over that sort of period of time, again, like the last 20, 30 years, you can see that the exports of fish have gone up a little bit from the UK, but the imports, in terms of value and volume, have both risen increasingly. So the so-called trade deficit, the line just shown there, has grown. So we're becoming more and more of a net importer of seafood into the UK every year, both in terms of value and volume. Next one. And what is it we eat? Well, these are the top things that we like to eat, the big five, they call them at the top there. Salmon, cod, tuna, prawns, haddock. Prawns being warm water prawns, tiger prawns that you can buy in supermarkets but quite cheaply. All the things that we like to eat, we import, and all the things we catch, we export, pretty much, as a sort of take-home message. So, for instance, the cod that you eat that comes from, comes from Iceland and Norway and other places in the north. It doesn't come from the UK. We catch small amounts of it, but then they mainly exported. Warm water prawns that we all like eating now, they've become very popular. They've all come from outside of the UK, nothing's grown. Our major fishery, our biggest single fishery in the UK is nephrops, and all of that goes out as an export. You can't buy nephrops anywhere really unless you're eating in very high-end restaurants in different parts of Britain and London maybe. There's a deficit in how much seafood we eat generally, so we should be eating 140 gram portions a week, one oily fish, one non-oily fish. Despite that, all the mackerel we catch also get exported, pretty much. We don't eat any of those. So we have roughly the same amount that we catch and grow, we export, and we import the same amounts. Interestingly, I find here for salmon, this sort of import-export line is almost the same length, and actually most of the salmon that you eat, again, unless you're eating in high-end places, is probably Norwegian. Most of the salmon we produce goes out to other places who pay more than we do. So our own seafood goes out. Okay, that's good. That's that one, I think. So in the next slide, where does it come from? Where do all those imports come from? Well, they come mainly from countries like China, Thailand, India, Bangladesh, South America, so countries in South America like Ecuador, Brazil, Venezuela, that kind of thing. But you can see here that China globally is by far the biggest producer of fish globally, 66 million tonnes per annum produced. The UK, UK would be way down here somewhere in terms of production. And interestingly, as I said at the start, China and these countries in Southeast Asia have already grasped the idea they need to grow a lot more than they catch. That's the kind of concept. So in China, 2/3 of their 66 million metric tonnes is produced in ponds and cages for selling to people. Only 1/3 comes from fisheries. The UK, on the other hand, at the moment has a 2/3 fishery, 1/3 aquaculture. We have about 1 million metric tonnes. So again, we're kind of down here somewhere on the scale at about 1. Okay, next one. So just to kind of put that into context before we kind of wrap up. So this is what happens. So you start on the left there. Global population reaches 9 billion by 2050. That's going to happen. You get this rapidly expanding middle class who can afford to buy the food that we're eating, and they're going to buy it themselves. You get elevated food production required and changes in consumption. Consumption, as people get richer, goes from just eating more calories to changing the calories they eat. So they go from eating grains and so on to eating fish and meat and dairy products. So the so-called westernisation of the diet. That leads to significant acceleration of trading. Seafood is the most highly traded commodity, meaning that aquatic production, just to keep track of where we're eating at the moment, has got to double by 2050 just to stay where we are now. And that's the headline. And that's got to be done in terms of a flatline fishery. So where's that going to come from? It's going to come from growing